thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Center of Policy Research and Governance, I would like to welcome all of you to this event. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Tejasvi Panjar, and I am currently interning with CPRG. So I would now like to introduce our guest speaker for today. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Khagesh Gautam, who will be speaking on the theme, Legalization of Cannabis, the next big question of civil liberties in India. Our guest speaker today, Dr. Gautam, is an associate of law at Jindal Global Law School. He specializes in constitutional law, constitutional and comparative aspects of the law of criminal procedure and evidence. He has published over 20 research articles and book chapters and has co-authored a book on comparative study of emergency powers. His research has been published by Standard Journal of International Law, Columbia Journal of Asian Law, and several other leading law reviews globally. Professor Gautam joined the bar in 2008 and has practiced law before the Supreme Court of India and Punjab and Haryana High Court. All my personal interactions with him have been extremely informational, delightful, and above all, enjoyable. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tejasvi, for having me. And thank you for the CPRG for this event. I'm very delighted to be here, and I hope this event turns out to be a useful one. I believe this debate has been overdue in India, and I believe this event, I hope this event turns out to be a useful contribution towards that, in that direction.
Once again, we are glad you could be here with us today to share your insights. So, like you said, the debate around cannabis criminalization has been a long one. But even longer is India's history with cannabis consumption. It was woven into the Hindu culture for spiritual and religious purposes, and it was also around for medicinal and recreational reasons. So I think it will be insightful to start this discussion with the background on the history of cannabis in India, primarily in the legal context and the legal status.
Right. Thank you, Tejasvi, for that question. And again, once again, very good afternoon to all of those in attendance. I'm very glad to see that one of my old friends from college, Mr. Arun Kumar Mishra, is in attendance today. Hi, Arun, if you're able to see me. Arun and I have been in law school together. We both started law school in 2005. That was the year in which I was first introduced formally to Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, the infamous NDPS Act of 1985. In 2005, the substance was illegal. It continues to be illegal. As per the NDPS Act, the substance is defined, the plant cannabis is defined in a different subsection, but ganja, which is the flowering top of the plant, charas, which is hand rubbed or extracted by other methods from the leaves or the plants, from the leaves, sometimes of the other parts, and then the seed, which is used to prepare the drink famously known as bhang. Except for the seed, all other parts of the plants are criminalized, in the sense that if I'm found in possession of, say, 1 ounce of ganja in my pocket, that would be 28 grams approximately, I could potentially be arrested, detained in a prison as if I was a very serious criminal threat to the society. And then lakhs of rupees will be spent on prosecuting me, putting me through the criminal justice system, ultimately finding me guilty, and then incarcerating me in the prisons so that I could serve out a prison sentence. All this for reasons which are not entirely unknown. And a detailed examination of this shows that I've just finished a manuscript on this. And if I start from the year 1600, that's where I begin in the book. So starting from the year 1600 all the way till 1857, the first war of independence or the first armed revolt against the British, until in between this period of time, the year 1600 to the year 1857, there is no criminal prohibition on the substance in any way, shape or form. In fact, certain excise legislations show that this commodity is actually an excisable commodity. Excise is a tax on manufacturing. Therefore, it stands to reason that if the item is mentioned as an excisable item, it's apparently legally regulated. And the absence of any detailed rules also shows that the regulation of this trade was mostly left to the inhabitants. Then, starting from the year 1857 all the way till the year 1930. The year 1930 is very important to note, because the year 1930 is when a law by the name of Dangerous Drugs Act is enacted. And till from 1857 till 1930, there is no criminal prohibition on the substance. In between, a question is raised in the British Parliament, as a result of which a British commission is set up. It's called the Indian Drug and Hemp Commission, the IDHC, which gives its report close to 1894. Now, there's not a lot of time lost between 1894 and 1930 if you take apart the changing of the century. Uh, in this report, it has actually been recommended in writing to the British government that the substance should not be, the plant rather, I think the right phrase would be plant, because cannabis indica or cannabis sativa ultimately are plants, that this plant should not be criminalized, and then detailed projections as to the revenue that can be made and that is being collected is then presented. So we have a situation where until the end of until the beginning of the year 1900, that decade, the British government was recommended by its own commission not to criminalize it. And then it's supported by the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1930, which defines cannabis in the exact same way as it is defined today in the NDPS Act. But from section 4 onwards, the sections that criminalize cultivation or possession, etc., of dangerous drugs, even though cannabis is defined as a dangerous drug, it's not criminalized as such. I believe it is explained by the policy that the British had adopted, supported by the IDHC report, as well as the domestic excise legislations, which list ganja and charas as excisable commodities. After the year 1930, you will see that I will take a brief detour here. From the year 1930, if we go till the year 1947, when independence was obtained from British rule, there is nothing criminal against this substance. It's legally regulated, available for public consumption. Then from the year 1947 till the year 1949, when the constitution is adopted and the republic is proclaimed again, no criminal prohibition. And from the year 1949/50 all the way till the year 1985, there is again no criminal prohibition as such. And again, the item is consistently mentioned, for example, in the excise legislations of various state legislatures. That seems to be the situation. Also, I'd like to end this part with a very brief remark. Notwithstanding the Dangerous Drugs Act, the Constitution of India and the constitutional document that obtained before independence, the Government of India Act of 1935, both indeed specifically authorize only the provincial and now the state legislatures to impose duties of excise. I believe a fair reading of that will amounts to the situation where it turns out to be the case that Parliament perhaps might not even be constitutionally competent to criminalize this plant.
So you mentioned 1985, and now we have to talk about the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985. That is the main act responsible for criminalization of cannabis. And now that we have a time frame of cannabis and its legal status, could you walk us through the proceedings of the 8th Lok Sabha, which led to the enactment of the act, and critically evaluate its rationale for us? What was the rationale for criminalizing cannabis?
Right. Thank you, Tejsi. That's a very important question. And uh, as you very correctly mentioned, the NDPS Act was enacted by the 8th Lok Sabha. Now, the NDPS Act was as NDPS bill was debated, and at that point of time, it was piloted by the Minister of Finance, Shri Vishwanath Pratap Singh, later became the Prime Minister of India. He was the finance minister in the cabinet of Prime Minister Shri Rajiv Gandhi, late Shri Rajiv Gandhi. And he actually introduced the bill, made a short speech uh, uh, that is discussed in detail, but there's no point mentioning it here. The bill was piloted through the House, through the Lok Sabha, by the Minister of State Finance at that point of time. And he, I believe, piloted the bill very deftly. A lot of questions were put to him that he very conveniently and very diplomatically sidestepped. But those questions do arise. For instance, one of the problems that I have identified in the 8th Lok Sabha's manner in which they handled the debate. First of all, the bill was not sent to any sort of bipartisan parliamentary standing committee or a select committee or a study committee of any sort. In fact, this fact was pointed out by Shri V.S. Krishna Iyer, not to be confused with Justice V.K. Krishna Iyer. V.S. Krishna Iyer was the member parliament from Bangalore South. And I quote to you what he said on the floor of the Lok Sabha on 28th of August 1985. He said, and I quote, "You have bought a comprehensive bill, but unfortunately, there is no time to think over it. There is no time to think over it, and the bill is rushed through the House." And then he goes on to make some other suggestions. So on this basis, and from the fact that from what is very clear from the manner in which the bill was debated, I believe first criticism that does apply is that the bill seems to have been drafted in a haste. Unfortunately, the year 1985 is also the year I was born in. It's unfortunate because of this bill. It's not unfortunate for any other reasons. But this is a truth that all of us were born into. We did not enact the NDPS bill. None of us probably voted for it. It was just there. When I went to law school with my friend Arun, it was just there. There was nothing that could be done about it. Now, when I take a step back, I suddenly start realizing that the only imagination that I was ever exposed to, that perhaps many of us were ever exposed to, was that this is a dangerous drug. It should be avoided. Criminal elements smoke it, or it is used in tantric practice of a dark nature. All sorts of myth and negative connotations were consistently attached to it. But what added to it, I believe what this misconception about the substance that has to be first and foremost clarified, it's very clearly demonstrated by a review of the 8th Lok Sabha. For instance, take a look at some of the claims that are being made. 50% of the students in Delhi and 72% of students in Government Medical College Patiala were harmfully exposed to substances such as ganja. This is mentioned on 7th of August 1985 by E. Ayappu Reddy. You have another claim. 35% of students alone are regularly consuming these substances. Certain plants and substances are so inherently addictive so as to cause addiction upon administration of second or third dose itself. Clearly, the member parliaments, only 16 of them spoke, by the way, that day out of 420 that the winning party commanded. They have clearly seem to have no clear idea about what addiction is. Then they say consumption of and addiction to narcotic drugs was somehow restricted to rich people, whereas the 1894 IDHC report clearly shows that this is a poor man's narcotic. There is clearly a contradiction here that needs to be explained. And then you have the blame the addict approach. You have reliance on the gateway drug theory that has now been by and large discredited. So I'll make one brief mention of the gateway drug theory. One MP remarked that the gateway drug theory is actually responsible in the sense it shows how addictive or how dangerous cannabis is, so as it should be criminally prohibited. However, research now shows that just like many people who consume perhaps a glass of beer in college, and in many cases more than a few, I'm quite sure, just like many people consume a glass of beer and go on to live responsible adult lives, don't become alcoholics. Similarly, many people go on to consume cannabis and go on to live responsible and productive adult lives without causing any harm or damage to anyone. So I think this perception, I think, has to be changed. And I think the perception was not right because no systematic effort, I believe, was ever made by those responsible in the 8th Lok Sabha to understand and get familiar with the substance. And I can keep on adding examples, but I think the point has been made. It's very clear that in my respectful opinion, it's very clear that the 8th Lok Sabha, the MPs who spoke in the 8th Lok Sabha on 7th, 26th, and 28th of August 1985 clearly did not have as good and as polished an understanding of the substance and its connected uses and harms, etc., whatever they might be, as the topic deserved. It was pointed out that the bill be sent to some sort of expert committee. It is being rushed, but none of that actually worked.
So you spoke about addiction briefly, and that is a very contemporary topic even today. And I think it would be very beneficial for the audience and myself if you could expand on what really is meant by addiction clinically, that is, because clearly we see that the MPs at that time, the ones that spoke, had some sort of misinformation and misconception about it. Professor, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's an important question. That's a question that I get very often. I think a lot of people might be genuinely interested in the question of addiction. Now, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a historian or an anthropologist or an addiction expert in the sense I don't have a medical degree. I do have a doctorate that's in law. I'm a doctor of law, not of medicine. But whatever I have understood, it seems to be the case that we have to distinguish between use, dependence, and addiction. People use substances, people use tobacco, people use alcohol, people use all sorts of substances. People are addicted to eating sweets or eating junk food. People are addicted to gambling. Those are behavioral addictions. And the understanding of addiction as per medical science, we'll get that to the end. But first is some people use some substances, experiment with them, and then nothing becomes of them. As a pop example, not as an academic example, if you go on YouTube, there's a very interesting video on YouTube where 3 old guys are senior citizens are smoking weed. All of them are, 2 of them are Caucasians, 1 an African American. It's a very popular video on YouTube, very funny. But if you look at the third gentleman in that video, he says, I'm a happy-go-lucky guy. I've never felt the need to consume any substances. I have met quite a few people in my life. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those who never have any need. So it's a personal thing. From use, we get to dependence. Now, assume a hypothetical situation where I'm hurt and I'm hurt so badly, or I have undergone a surgery or operation or some sort of therapy so badly that I need to be infused with some opium-based pain addiction medicine. After a while, I will get dependent on that medicine. But there are ways to get people on the medicine and then get people off medicine. A version of this, I believe, is used to treat addicts, where people who are addicted to opium or opioids are prescribed methadone, and then methadone is used to treat their withdrawal. So as far as dependence is concerned, one could become dependent on a substance because of prolonged use. This has got nothing to do with addiction. Addiction is actually different from all these 3. Now, speaking of this, in the West, there are big textbooks, DSM-5, DSM-4, things of that nature. Medical authorities on the subject, they point out the limitation that this debate suffers from. To begin with, we have to note that just like any other substance, cannabis could be abused. So it is irresponsible, it is not correct to state that cannabis is not subject to abuse. But remember, so is gambling, so is shopping, so is social media, so is opium, so is burgers, so is anything and everything is subject to abuse. But what is understood as cannabis dependence syndrome is caused in heavy chronic users and is exhibited by a lack of control over use and continued use despite adverse personal consequences. Addiction is about harm. Addiction is about harm to self, about harm to others. And that's something that I believe 8th Lok Sabha completely overlooked. The concept of harm is completely absent from the pages of the Lok Sabha reports. I will end this segment, this question by a quote from an article published in the Washington Post, and it says, and I quote, "Fewer than 1 in 10 marijuana smokers become regular users of the drug, and most voluntarily cease their use after 34 years of age. By comparison, 15% of alcohol consumers and 32% of tobacco smokers exhibit symptoms of drug dependence, not addiction, dependence. We are talking here about dependence. Addiction is psychological, it's a different thing. So I hope that provides some clarity, but I'll wait for any follow-up questions for you.
Thank you, sir. That actually clarifies a lot of it. Also, you spoke about opium, and we see a lot of misconception about the substance in question here. Often, cannabis is equalized to a bunch of other very hard drugs, and that is just a result of misinformation and misconception. So, did that play a role in the 8th Lok Sabha proceedings?
Yes, in fact, and it's very interesting. In fact, Mr. Amitabh Bachchan, the famous film star, and because this is being recorded, my apologies to the great man, but Mr. Bachchan, who was at that point of time Member Parliament from Allahabad constituency, he's speaking in the Lok Sabha, so the place and the stature is important. Mr. Amitabh Bachchan confused it. Some other speakers who spoke that day also confused it. There's a quote that I'd like to make here, according to which the situation, the understanding seems to be that heroin, which is an opiate, and charas, which is actually nothing but THC in a different form, these are actually coming from the same plant, and that both of them are somehow the same thing. Actually, I have my research shows, and people who grow opium on license, some people I've spoken to, they have pointed out to my attention, of course this needs to be confirmed by somebody else, that the manner in which the substance looks or appears to the untrained eye, one is liable to make that confusion. Of course, the trained eye will not be able to make that, will not fall into that trap. And I'm trying to find that quote from my notes, but I can't seem to locate it right now. Yes, I located this quote. This is Shri Moolchand Daga, who moved a calling attention motion, as a result of which the NDPS bill is actually introduced. This gentleman on the floor of the Lok Sabha on 28th August says, and I quote, "Recently we came across a news item that students and research scholars in the laboratory of Lucknow University were selling," note now what he says, "opium in the form of heroin and hashish." Heroin and hashish is also the same thing. They are all derived from opium. This is a sample quote. The Lok Sabha report is filled with such. I think this is quite clear, convincing evidence that they had very little understanding of the cannabis plant.
Absolutely. So I think the case has been made very strong. But now I feel like I have to ask this sort of a philosophical question, if you allow. So, okay, there is a lot of taboo and moral dilemma we see in the society, that is associated with cannabis use. And so this is sort of a what came first, chicken or the egg kind of question. Do you think that the taboo is what derailed the process of legalization of cannabis in India? Or was it the criminalization in 1985 that led to the taboo against it?
I think it might be a little bit of a mixed problem. One might have caused the other, and in turn the other causes, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. I can't really go into the details of this question, though I concede the question does arise, and the question has to be answered. But my limited training is my training is limited to law, and I think somebody more educated in histories or anthropology or sociology might be more equipped to answer this question. But what certainly seems to be the case is that, personally speaking, in my family, it was never mentioned. It wasn't as if we were warned by our parents, please don't go and consume it. I was born and brought up in the holy city of Kurukshetra. It's a very small town, but it's a university town, and it's growing bigger now. And it has a lot of temples. there is a tradition of Shiv worship, there's a tradition of Shakti worship. And we were always kind of aware that sadhus and babas and sannyasis and gurus of some sort, they use it for their tantric or their spiritual practices. But nobody ever warned us. For example, we were warned, please don't drink, it's harmful, stay away from tobacco, it's harmful. Nobody ever spoke to me about this, or my siblings. So we sort of grew up in this scenario, or in this environment where we had no idea about the substance. And slowly, as I educated myself and went into the details of the substance and its uses, so on and so forth, I realized that the more you talk to people, the taboo seems to be hidden. It does come out once you start talking to people about it, because most people don't want to talk about it. Most people don't know how to talk about it. Most people are probably, I probably believe there are a lot of closeted weed smokers in this country, like they used to be closeted opium eaters or whatever. People are doing this, they're not telling anyone. Then there are sadhus and babas who regular fold of the society, and then of course we never know about them. But in the West, the research has been done and it's been legalized. So I think on that note, whether criminalization caused the taboo or whether taboo resulted in criminalization, I think it's most more of a mixed problem. However, it seems to be the case from the 1894 IDHC report that an element of taboo, a very small element of taboo, might have been associated with the substance. But on the other hand, the 2019 survey by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, that actually shows that the younger generation perhaps might be more open as compared to the older generations.
Absolutely. I think we have a lot of evidence from around surveys that show that cannabis consumption is very much prevalent in India as of today. So I think we have made the case, the legal case for decriminalization is quite strong. And before we conclude our discussion and move on to the questions from the audience, I would once and for all like to hear your stand on the next big question of civil liberty. Are you advocating for the decriminalization and ultimately complete legalization of cannabis in India?
Thank you, Tejsi. Yes, I am advocating A for a I'm advocating first of all for decriminalization. That being found in possession of a few ounces of ganja or charas, it shouldn't be an act that results in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years in prison. It's absurd. It shouldn't be the case. It's not the case in almost all civilizations or civilized nations. The system of whom we admire and follow, try to follow, and are inspired by in the West. In Canada, it's entirely legal. US, it's becoming more and more legal. In fact, if you look at the globe, the entire North American hemisphere is going to legalize it soon enough. There are legislations moved in the Mexican Congress, which follows the presidential system like the Americans. So we have the entire North American hemisphere that's on the verge of legalizing it. It is a very strange question to my mind. Of course, I'm willing to listen and I might be wrong. It's very strange to my mind to even think that we should decriminalize it. It's going on already. I look at YouTube lectures sometimes, very good lectures, people speaking in top universities, very good top scientists speaking, and people in audience sometimes make a comment, well, if you're going to legalize it, then it would be more widely available. And then it is very politely, but it is widely available. It is widely available. So the second point that I'm making is open that up for taxation. And that then opens up the way for full legalization. There are important books, works, research papers available on what type of model should be followed for legalization. Now, of course, for the constraint of space and for the technicalities that are associated with the argument, economists and other trained professionals have to make that argument. I'm more concerned with educating the people about the substance, and I believe it should be decriminalized, that being in possession of a few ounces of ganja or charas or any of hash oil, for example, or any of those extracts, it should not be a criminal offense. In my respectful view, the position of an average ganja smoker is no different than that of an average tobacco smoker. And I think we as a people and we as a nation have to become aware of this. So first, stop criminalization. That results in an additional benefit. You have a whole host of pending cases in the trial judiciary, high courts, and the Supreme Court that will vanish. But of course, we'll need to draft legislation sensibly and anticipate litigation. And if litigation occurs, the state has to go to the court with a spirit of assisting the court and not actually fighting out the case. That's one. Second, legalization. But I think the argument has to be made in a more nuanced way by more experts, people who are more learned in this area. C, and quite independent of that, it's a claim. And the claim is, constitutionally speaking, there is absolutely nothing that prohibits trade in cannabis. There is absolutely nothing that says that it should be prohibited. And I think the Constitution, and before that, the Government of India Act 1935 clearly pointed out that it's a trading activity. It should be allowed to be continued. And whether somebody wishes to consume a glass of beer or a glass of wine or smoke a joint should be there and is indeed their personal preference. We should stop criminalizing people for petty and silly offenses such as these. So I think constitutionally, from a public policy perspective, from a legal perspective, I think the case is there. I believe it has been made briefly today, and I hope it is good.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much. On that note, I feel like we can conclude our discussion. I hope you all enjoyed that talk as much as I did. Now I would request Dr. Gautam to answer some questions that were sent to us. And as a reminder, you can still submit your questions on the chat or raise your hand and we will address them. I already see your hand raised. So, sir, shall we start with the questions?
Yes, Teji, may I request, there's a lady in attendance by the name of Priya Mishra who goes by the famous handle Hempavati. Let's take her question first. It's very
absolutely, sir.
important that we do.
Absolutely, sir.
If you're here, Priya, please go ahead. I saw your hand up earlier. Or if not, I leave it to you, Teji. So I think I'll go with Harshit first. Your hand is up.
Hey, Mr. Khagesh, how's it going?
It's going good, thank you.
I have to say, I really enjoyed your talk, and you mentioned some very important points. And I'm actually very impressed by the fact that you are so vocal about your opinions on cannabis, especially in India, considering how society views it as something negative. I have a few questions in regards to how you plan on making this a big movement and bringing it out to the people in a way where they would accept it and which would possibly lead to legalization in the future.
Thanks for that question. It's a bit embarrassing. I have no plans to make it a big movement. I think the movement is already going on. The great legalization movement, I think some cases have been fought in the Delhi High Court as well. This is just a modest contribution. I hope the people read this book. I hope the legislators read this book, and I hope the arguments are followed. But I do plan to write about this subject, and thanks for your appreciation.
Of course, and I had a few questions regarding how you plan on legalizing it. In the sense, I personally know people that live in countries where it's legal, or should I say states where it's legal, and I've seen how these businesses are conducted, and I was wondering how you plan on making use of that tax money to improve the livelihoods of people in India, because I personally feel like if cannabis was brought to mainstream in India, I feel like it would attract a lot of tourists besides just the tax money which you would be getting. And I feel like all that money could be used for a lot of good things in our country. And we do need tourism, because tourism is like one of the biggest factors when it comes to raising a country's GDP. I mean, when you look at all the successful nations, a lot of them have a very strong tourist index. You get what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. That's a very good point. So far as tourism industry is concerned, I've made this point in my book that's very recently finished. So yes, I take that point. I also believe, and I know for a fact, that this type of cannabis tourism is going on in India as we speak. It's just not legally recognized. There is no mechanism. So far as what to do with that money, the money will go into the consolidated fund of Republic of India. and the Parliament of India will decide what to do with that money. Money isn't mine. Who am I to decide it?
I hear you, but I feel like since you're pretty well educated about the subject, I feel like you would be the right person to, bring this issue up to like the broader public
I'm sorry,
and educate them on the topic.
spending of public money is a public question. My book is about legalizing the plant, not spending the money. So it's a good question, but I can't answer it. The people will answer that question. So I think I'll move to the next.
Yeah. So Harshit, thank you for the question. Harshit Chauhan, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah, oh yeah, by the way,
Please go.
Yeah. So my question was, under Section 31A of NDPS, there's a provision of death penalty. So how realistic is it? We are like, I know there would be at some point legalization of recreational use of cannabis, but like for the starting point, we can go around and talk to like activists who are involved with death penalty, work on death penalty, and can see like where this thing on Section 31A can go. Also, like you mentioned, in Lok Sabha, it was said that it is a gateway drug. So as a college student with my experience, I can say, because it is not available in the pharmacy and college students have to go to hardened criminal to buy these drugs, they might get access to other hardened drugs. So it would be very easy if the government make pharmacies where cannabis is available, then more college student would not like drift towards other hard drugs like cocaine or MD. That's it.
That's a very good point. I think you make a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks for that, Karthik.
And Professor, someone has also dropped a question in the chat box.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
So I will request Tejashi to read out that questions.
I have a question from Mr. Bhupesh Vashisht.
And,
can I read it?
And from Abhishek Mishra also.
Abhishek Mishra. Okay, right. I have a question from Mr. Abhishek Mishra. I'll go to that first. Mr. Mishra says, quote, can we say that the debate was overlooked in Lok Sabha because of pressure from the US? Mr. Mishra, I'm not quite sure if that conclusion could be made just from the debates in the Lok Sabha. I have not found any such evidence as to what might have happened in the party. Of course, I'm not privy to that paperwork, but I don't think it is correct to suggest that there was any overt pressure from the US government, or I think it's correct to suggest that no such inference could fairly be made out of Lok Sabha debates. I could not make out any such inference from the Lok Sabha debates as such. But yes, the pressure element certainly is there, because the single convention was signed and the time period of 25 years was getting up. So I think that element is there. But if there was any pressure, more archival materials would have to be consulted before anything can be said with certainty. I hope that answers your question. I have a question from Tanya Isser. She says, the fact that cannabis are conveniently available to black markets in India, who do you think suffers the most from criminal? I think the fellow who suffers the most, Tanya, is the poor dealer who might have been forced to do nothing but deal in the substance because of a whole host of circumstances that we can only predict and guess. And then this dealer, who could have been registered under the GST Act, who could have made his livelihood in a legal way by paying taxes to the government, and then should have been able to put his money in a bank account and buy some property and secure the future of his children and his dependents, is now treated by the law, and we are compelled to treat this person by law as a criminal. I put it to you that there is nothing inherently criminal in the substance. For instance, one of the instances documented in the IDHC report, Tanya, in 1894, this report says that a lot of people who hand rub charas out of the ganja plant, actually in the northern region, in the mountains, they do it in order to give away that charas to quote fakirs visiting from Badrinath and Kedarnath. Now, I put it to you that if I am extracting charas from the cannabis plant with the intention in my heart to offer it to a deity, or to offer it to a godman or to a guru, how can criminality even be attached to such an act? It's a very, very fundamental question. And I think who suffers? I think the poor fellow who does this as a business, he suffers the most. So I think he suffers the most. I think everybody suffers, but he suffers the most. So I hope, Tanya, that answers your question. I have another question from Mr. Vashisht, who says, I am an Ayurveda practitioner from Kurukshetra and from the same school of Professor. I don't know which school because I went to quite a few, but thank you, Mr. Vashisht. The taboo does bring a lot of disrepute the herb despite of its medical benefits. I just want to know what are the current laws that stop it from making the NDPS Act, Mr. Vishesh. That's a very, very good question. NDPS Act does it. I have identified a lot of provisions of the NDPS Act, some 98 provisions in total in a detailed appendix in the work that I've finished. And I think in my opinion, I think all the major sections of the NDPS Act are already identified and located. All we need is just a legislation taking them out. So NDPS Act is the one that is stopping it from becoming a legalized drug specifically. And then there could be other laws that could come into play, but the primary one is the NDPS Act. I think that takes care of the question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So we also have a hand raised from Karthik Arya, and he has not yet asked his question.
Yes, Mr. Arya.
Oh, Mr. Khagesh, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you believe the public would have to be educated on the topic before something like legalization would be possible? Because when you legalize something, you're also telling kids and all kinds of children that this sort of a thing is accepted. And that could create a whole new attitude in kids who think it's kind of cool or it's okay to do these kinds of things at a very young age. And they could possibly go through the wrong path and end up in like a very bad situation. And my other question, a follow-up question would be, do you personally indulge in cannabis?
I think it's a very embarrassing question that should not have been asked, but I think since Tejsi is the host and she invited Karthik to go first, I'd like to answer Karthik's question and I'll take Mr. Balaji's question afterwards.
Thank you, sir. First of all, it's always a pleasure listening to you talk, and thankfully I've had that opportunity. My question to you, sir, is that, so I believe that the decriminalization of cannabis or charas is directly linked to how the society views its use, and be it medicinal or recreational. And I just find myself in a bind of what we as a society can do to even talk about it because of a taboo that it is.
See, Karthik, I think the cause of taboo is first of all, I told you, people don't understand. The people understand neither the nature of addiction nor the nature of the plant. And as you just saw, Balaji asked me a very fair question. This, in fact, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, has written a very interesting article in The Print. And in that article, he begins with a qualification that I have never consumed any of these substances in my life. Whereas Member Parliament from Biju Janata Dal in Lok Sabha himself, when he introduces the debate, he is very open about his personal use. I think there is a great lesson to be learned. And I think my response to Mr. Balaji's question itself shows that the taboo is present. And I think the taboo has to be broken. I think more and more people have to come out and accept. Come out and tell. For example, if somebody does not have any problem admitting in a public forum that they would like to have a glass of beer now and then, the people should not have a problem confessing in public forum that they consume a little bit of marijuana now and then. But remember, in India, it's criminal. So any such concession, any such confession, any such admission itself is criminal. So I think Mr. Balaji should be reminded that apart from the embarrassing element, which is obviously there in this question, and the violation of personal privacy that comes with that question, I think the laws themselves are designed such a way that a person of my level who has actually finished a book feels uncomfortable answering that question either in positive or in negative. For if you say yes, then you're subjected to ridicule. If you say no, it's admission by denial. So it's a question that's best left unanswered. But insofar as the other question, the other part of the question that was put, I think we need to, we are not aware of the substance, we're not aware of addiction, we're not aware of dependence. Addiction is predominantly psychological, and I think a lot of taboo that is attached, this is my view, it's subject to discussion, it could be wrong, therefore this book is not there in writing as such in the book, but my view is that because of the taboo that is attached to this substance and the kind of preconceived notions that go with the consumption of this substance, it's very much possible that even right-minded people who wish to research this, who wish to study this, are perhaps, and I believe they are indeed, prohibited. Like a chilling effect is created in their mind and in their heart. If you want a good academic career, don't dabble into these things, don't research into these things. I think books such as this and other wealth of literature that already exists on the subject, my book is just one contribution, I think they go a long way. I think books such as these can then be converted into courses that can be taught in global law school and other schools, as a result of which students are made aware of the harms and the benefits. And somebody who's not even inclined to consume any substance should not be prohibited from doing research into this, because ultimately it brings relief from physical pain, it brings relief from psychological pain, and like any other substance, it is just as addictive, because addiction is not substance based. Addicts are created by their circumstances, by the traumas that they face. No substance is as such addictive, but yes, some substances, because of their high toxicity ratio, are more lethal than others. It is the case that not one human being has ever died of a THC overdose, but intoxication is ultimately intoxication, and if you're intoxicated, you owe it to yourself and to society to be responsible. But I don't think there is anything inherently dangerous in the plant. And so far as the question that was put by Mr. Balaji, am I not, I believe this is what he said, am I not encouraging people? I'm not encouraging anybody. If I talk about tennis and somebody feels inclined to play tennis, have I encouraged that person? No. I've talked about the game tennis. The person was already inclined to play it.
I get what you mean. Like, that's a good point that you just mentioned. But my other question is, was there a certain event that triggered you to do more research onto this topic and write a book eventually? Was there a certain event, or was there a certain person you took inspiration from?
Yeah, I took inspiration. There are events that happened, but I would request you to, respect my privacy, and something I can't
Yes.
talk to.
Professor, we have a question from Nissan Jain.
I beg your pardon?
We have a question from Nishan Jain. So I'll just read it out for you. So it says, so are you convinced with the model of legalization of cannabis in the United States? What changes would you recommend if the model has to be adapted as per the Indian scenario?
So one of the things that I would recommend, of course, I am not an expert in business or economics, but one of the things that I can see is that the cultivation of the substance should not be licensed. Like opium cultivation is licensed under the Opium Act and other laws. I think cannabis cultivation should not be licensed. I think it should be left to the discretion of the farmers, because you don't need a lot of land to farm it anyway. I mean, not a lot of people consume it anyway. A small percentage of the population actually consumes the substance, and demand is not likely to become manifold over a few years. So farmers should have the right to cultivate it or not. But once it is cultivated and once it is converted into any sort of products that could be available for public consumption, some kind of independent quality control will have to be implemented at that stage. It will have to be decided whether we are going to permit only medicinal use, are we going to permit medicinal as well as personal use. I am not very fond of the phrase recreational use, so I prefer the term personal use. Of course, for spiritual purposes, sadhus, etc., have always been consuming it, and no sadhu has ever been arrested for having a chillum and some ganja in his chillum, because those are different reasons. I think then a distinction might have to be made between CBD only strains, which are not psychoactive, and THC and CBD combined strains, and depending on the percentage of the THC in the strain, whether or not, I mean, some sort of quality control will eventually have to come in. I think experts will have to be called in. I think it's a much longer discussion that commands a book on its own. I think the first question should be, let's just decriminalize this and convert it into something equivalent of a traffic violation. I think that's the way to begin with. And then we will have the substance more widely and openly consumed, which will open up the room for scientists and researchers to actually go in the field and study. please remember that all the legalization impact studies, as I call them, that it's illegal now, it's legalized now, what was the impact? All these are studies that are predominantly conducted in the West, where the target population is largely Caucasian or African American or some subset of an American or Canadian population. Nobody has ever tested this in an Indian population setting because nobody is going to the field. So I believe step A, decriminalization, step B, legalization, no licensing for farmers, and that will then result in a situation where a few companies will end up creating logistical chains and supply mechanisms internationally and in India. At that point of time, the government will have enough players in the field to make up rules of the game.
Right, sir. So we have a question on the chat. It says marijuana is not just a word, it is a psychotropic propaganda. We need to understand and not go ahead and follow Western universalism. Your views on this?
Yes, it is. It is. There is an element of propaganda in it. I can't deny reefer madness and the work of Henry Anslinger. All that is very well documented, and its racist history is also very well documented. There's no need to regurgitate it. But remember that this happened in the US. This didn't happen in India. It was tried in India by the British, but it failed, and it's also documented. There was a systematic effort, I believe, by the colonial government in British India to connect madnesses and psychological disturbances of all sorts of variety with ganja consumption. It didn't work. It never worked, but they did it the same way in the US. And there, of course, how it was done, which was either done to marginalize some communities, or it turned out, I mean, that's again a chicken and egg problem, very interesting to study, much documented, ultimately irrelevant for us.
For that answer, sir. We have a hand raised by Mr. Abhishek Mishra.
Hello, sir. So my question would be like, if we see that more of the women are employed in Himachal Pradesh in this industry. So after legalization of cannabis, will it have effect on them, or the big players would overtake that industry and they will be marginalized as they are now?
It's possible. Look, when you're going to bring in organized capital, and when you're going to bring in organized, proper ways of doing business, some people will be wiped out. Other people will have to adapt. Such is the logic of capital. The bigger point has to be kept in mind. If 3 or 4 people who grow cannabis find themselves in a situation where they are competitively outnumbered by other people, well, then it's a problem that they will adapt to and they will have to respond to. But you can't start making business policies by keeping in mind the fact that a lot of people might go to business. People go to business because their business practices are not efficient. And unfortunately, in my considered view, which is liable to be criticized, a lot of our business practices, not just in ganja, which is illegal, otherwise also, are just simply not efficient. So we have to look at the bigger picture. In my opinion, the bigger picture is clarified by how much revenue can be earned, by how much employment can be generated. For example, I'll just make a brief quote and I'll request your patience. An Italian researcher by the name of Daniela Berti, she did some research in Malana village, which of course is very popular for its charas. And people in Malana village said, and I'm quoting from her book chapter, unless Jamlu God tells us to grow other crops, we will grow only cannabis. Cannabis has been grown here since time immemorial. This is the situation. It's not going to stop. And ultimately, the people who know how to cultivate and grow this crop, their minds are the ones which has the real wealth of information. How will that wealth of information be turned into capital benefits? It's for the capital investing people and these people to decide. I'm interested in neither growing cannabis nor selling it.
We have also a question from
Yes.
Aishwarya Sihar.
Yes, I'll just read that out. It says, with respect to US, there's a lot of pushback on legalization due to inevitable increase in traffic deaths. How do you recommend that the nations and policymaker deal with such fallout?
It's a big challenge. That's Aishwarya is a former student of mine, and she practices law at the bar. And I would expect nothing less from a JGLS graduate. Thank you, Aishwarya, for that question. See, the problem of driving under influence and the problem of criminalization of cannabis are two completely different problems. They have to be handled accordingly. We have laws in place and we have infrastructure in place to deal with drunk driving. I believe an apparatus of some sort of similar nature will have to be invented. But the argument that I'm focusing on is, why was cannabis made criminal? And the question that Aishwarya asks is actually a question that has to be asked 20 years down the line, maybe. Right now, it's not. People are driving under influence of alcohol, etc., and they are apprehended by the police whenever they want them to. The problem with cannabis is that works on the human body physiologically very differently, and there is seems to be the case that there is nothing reliable available, such as a breathalyzer test, to apply in this case. I think that's a challenge, and I think that's a challenge that we all can overcome. But I think that's a challenge that doesn't detract in any way from the case that is made today.
So I think we will take this one last question from Anushka Goel, and then we will conclude the session. The question says, arrests have been made by the NCB for possessions of quantities far less than 100 grams, specified as small quantities under the NDPS Act. Doesn't this give the police a sort of an arbitrary power to make arrests?
Yes, it does. There is this point, the small quantities loophole. It's very important to note that it was indeed mentioned in the Lok Sabha that such a thing might happen. Now we have a Ministry of Finance notification dated October 19, 2011, which can be retrieved online easily. I call it the small quantities notification, but the problem is Section 2, subsection XXIIA 22A of the NDPS Act defines small quantity as follows, quote, any quantity lesser than the quantity specified by the central government by notification in the official gazette. There is absolutely no clarity on what amounts to a small quantity and at what point of time the powers of arrest step in. So, hypothetically speaking, three men standing on a sidewalk, away from any residential area, maybe in a secluded area, maybe three friends smoking a joint and talking about a movie. Police can come and potentially arrest them or not arrest them. I have heard so many stories of such a nature that police do indeed exercise these powers arbitrarily, but I do not believe the blame lies entirely with the police, because the police are duty bound by their oath to enforce the laws of the Republic of India. If the laws of Republic of India are not giving any clear guidance to the police, how can the police be held responsible? It's the parliament where the law must change.
Right, sir. So we had one, Mr. Rishabh Agarwal. He had asked, he wanted to ask a question quite ago. So let's allow him to ask one question and then we will conclude it. So Mr. Rishabh, could you unmute yourself?
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So I have two short questions. So the first one being that a lot of people talked about how change in perception is the need of the hour in like decriminalizing cannabis right now. So do we have a course of action or a plan in place on how we go on from, like, let's take a hypothetical where we have been, like, all of us have been thoroughly informed about the medical benefits of cannabis. Do we have a plan in place how we go on from that change in perception to the actual decriminalization? Because that is going to involve a lot of complex steps and a lot of legislative procedures, which, like we all know, are like really complex in nature.
Thank you, Rishabh. That's an outstanding question. I'm very glad. Our time, I believe, is almost up, so we can end on this question. So, Rishabh, I believe the following route may be taken, but this is again me thinking out loud. Of course, modifications are welcome, comments and suggestions are also welcome. I think the first thing we, the people of India, have to do is to remove cannabis from the NDPS Act completely. Leave opium, methamphetamines, barbiturates, leave all the synthetic drugs in there. Remove cannabis from the ambit of NDPS Act of 1985 completely. I think that would be the Indian equivalent of, for example, there is a debate in the US which talks about descheduling of marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act 18 US Code, and putting it in some other schedule, maybe a less dangerous drug. So we don't have any such scheduling as such. So we should remove cannabis from NDPS Act completely. That decriminalizes everything. Immediately after that, I believe either at the state level or at the union level, we will need to set up a dedicated ministry that will have to go case by case, study every single case where people are currently languishing in prisons, and the charge was only possession of charas or ganja or any such. If there was opium or whatever, then the case is disqualified automatically, because one can expect a lot of clemency petitions immediately after that. So instead of burdening the president or the governor, one should have a ministry, and the ministry then advises the governor or the president, and then clemencies are granted accordingly. We should also expect a certain level of litigation that will come out of it. High courts will face certain litigations the moment you decriminalize. This litigation, I anticipate it mostly to be of a nature of habeas corpus relief, that I am now in prison for something that is no longer a crime. We have some case law guiding us, but in my respectful view, the case law isn't enough. We will then have to fashion new doctrines of law, and the government through their attorney general or the advocates general will have to appear in the court with a desire to assist and not fight the cases. So that is a very, very big challenge which will require ministry level intervention. A few years of this, and then of course a lot of cases from the judicial system will have to be thrown out. The same ministry, another department under this ministry, can take up this job, make a catalog of every single case pending. The substances ganja completely removed from the pipeline, and so that then results, I believe, in a lot of pending cases suddenly taken out of the logjam, and provides relief in the judicial pendency problem that we have pan India. This is just the benefit of decriminalization, so as to then eventually legalize and let it go on for a few years, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, see what happens, see how people react. Later on, we can think of a law, perhaps a small amendment in the GST. All we need is to decide how much is the percentage on which we are going to tax it. Whether it is medically a good idea, that decision has to be taken independently of the taxation law amendments. Once a medical body or a medical authority of some sort says it's all right to go ahead, like is the case with alcohol and with tobacco, the thing can then be put into the domain of GST Act or the local excise laws. Those legislations that existed before GST, they're still there. Not just commodities are taken out of it. If I want to trade in it, I can register as a dealer and I can start paying my taxes. I can have my business. I can register my business under the Partnership Act, LLP Act, a whole host of other laws. And this thing can go on. Accountants will benefit, tax lawyers will benefit, all sorts of lawyers will benefit, business professionals will benefit, academics will have a lot to study and lot to go on. Politicians will see what's the result. The people as a whole will benefit because the money will be there in the consolidated fund of either the state or the Union of India, and then the money can be spent as people wish. You can buy fighter planes or you can build more hospitals, though building more hospitals might be more desirable because this is a recurring income. It's not like you have sold a PSU. It's not a one-time income. It's going to come in year after year. And I've made some projections, and those projections have been submitted to the relevant authorities. They are also mentioned in the book.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gautam, for answering all of those questions. And also thank you so much for this great talk. It is upon us to keep an open mind and be receptive to all sides of the argument. It was a pleasure to hear someone with your expertise talk on the subject. And I would like to again congratulate you on your recently finished manuscript. I look forward to your book. And it was an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of the participants today. Thank you. Jai.
Professor, hello.
Yeah.
Professor Khagesh, thanks for the kind of this wonderful session. And I think for us, it was a very important session, not because of what it talks about the cannabis, because it also talks about the kind of unnecessary laws which overburdening our judiciary.
Yeah.
And you just rightly pointed out how we have, the laws which we don't need, we have laws, which unnecessarily kind of interfering the personal life of the people. And when we talk about judiciary overburden, and judiciary is not able to kind of uh, tackle the cases. We should also understand what judiciary is doing, what kind of our executive has been done in last year. They are not kind of you can say not kind of not scrutinizing the laws which we have since uh, many decades. So it's a very important discussion on the issue because it talks about two ways. First, we have unnecessary laws जो हमारे सिस्टम को ओवरबर्डन कर रहे हैं एंड हमारे एग्जीक्यूटिव को इंगेज कर रहे हैं, मतलब हमारे पुलिस सिस्टम को इंगेज कर रहे हैं, हमारे जुडिशरी को इंगेज कर रहे हैं, which we don't need. And second, they are also disturbing the kind of the traditional medical practitioner which we had in our villages, which we had in our kind of tribal area. So they had the access of the kind of many herbals plants. So cannabis was one of the them. But इस unnecessary laws की वजह से वो जो सारे जो practices थे वो भी disrupt हुए, वो भी उनके जो normal जो चीजें चल रही थी, उनके जो research चल रहे थे वो भी disturb हुए. So कई बार ऐसा होता है कि कोई law हमारे पास होता है, हम सोचते हैं कि ठीक है और हम उसको एटलीस्ट नॉर्मलाइज कर लेते हैं अपने लाइफ में. बट जब प्रोफेसर खगेश जैसे कुछ लोग एक नया पर्सपेक्टिव के साथ हमारे सामने आते हैं तो हमें पता चलता है कि प्रॉब्लम कितनी ज्यादा है. जो चीज हम सोचते थे कि खराब है या इट्स अ प्रॉब्लमेटिक या उसको हमने नॉर्मलाइज कर लिया है, वो वास्तव में कैसे लगातार हमारी लाइफ को डिस्टर्ब कर रही है और कैसे एक अननेसेसरी बर्डन हमारे सोसाइटी पर और हमारे सिस्टम पे क्रिएट कर रही है. थैंक्स, इट्स अ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग डिस्कशन प्रोफेसर, बिकॉज नाउ वी नो कि प्रॉब्लम कैसे होती है, कैसे ये पॉलिसी से जुड़ा हुआ है. इट्स ऑल अबाउट पॉलिसी बिकॉज इन आवर सिस्टम वी हैव सम यूजलेस पॉलिसीज जिसकी वजह से जो हमारा गवर्नेंस है वो डिस्टर्ब होता है. बट वी डोंट नीड टू, हमें टाइम नहीं मिलता सोचने का या हम उस पर उतना टाइम लगाते नहीं, हम उस चीज को मतलब टैबू क्रिएट कर लेते हैं कि नहीं इस पर कैसे बात कर सकते हैं. बट थैंक्स फॉर द दिस एनलाइटनिंग सेशन एंड नाउ वी हैव a new perspective on this issue. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ramanand, for those closing remarks. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. On behalf of CPRG, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great rest of the day.